you call it holding negotiations hostage when you're talking about as big an issue as a 40% job loss?
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
The United Auto Workers have expanded their strike again this week at 2 of the big 3 automakers, this time by 7,000 workers. That brings the total amount of UAW members to 25,000. 25,000 workers that are on strike. The strike expansion struck GM and Ford this time. At Ford, the Chicago assembly plant went on strike yesterday, Friday the 29th at noon Eastern time. At GM, it was the Lansing Delta Township assembly plant in Michigan. Ford was spared from the prior strike expansion last week because of the progress that they made the week prior. But negotiations have moved much more slowly this week, according to the UAW and according to Ford CEO Jim Farley, who said that they actually went backwards in negotiations this week. Stellantis was spared this time, according to Shawn Fain, a mere 3 minutes. They were spared because a mere 3 minutes before the UAW was scheduled to go live with plans to strike another Stellantis plant, 3 minutes before they were scheduled to go live with the announcement, Stellantis sent a frantic email and made, quote, significant progress on the 2009 cost of living adjustment, the right not to cross a picket line, and the right to strike over product commitments and plant closures. Shawn Fain has pointed to this last-minute change of plans as proof of his commitment to bargain in good faith. He's saying that where there's movement, he wants to reward that. And I think that he has, and I think that he has very much shown himself to be bargaining in good faith. Punishing people that don't move and rewarding people that do. The CEOs at the 2 companies that saw strike expansions this week did not see it that way, though, if you can imagine. Ford CEO Jim Farley says, "We have felt from the very beginning, between all the lines of our comments, that the original strike was premeditated and that everything is taking way too long. The actual events are predetermined before they happen. It's been very frustrating. I believe we could have reached a compromise on pay and benefits, but so far the UAW is holding the deal hostage over battery plants." And this is just an amazing thing to say because we know that Ford and all of these auto manufacturers did not seriously begin negotiating until a week before the strike. And the entire time leading up to the strike, UAW President Shawn Fain was like, look, September 14th, a deadline, not a reference point, right? This is, there's going to be consequences if we don't have a fair contract by September the 14th. And they didn't meet the deadline. So, and so that's what's happening. It's it's just amazing that they can go out there and say this kind of stuff and that they, don't get pushback from the people that are reporting on their comments. GM CEO Mary Barra was also very critical. She said, "It's clear that there's no intent to get to an agreement," which is, again, fascinating to say because we just saw this week Stellantis being rewarded for movement. There's clear intent to get to an agreement and there's clear willingness to limit strikes where there is movement. There's clear intent to get to an agreement. Mary Barra said, "It's clear Shawn Fain wants to make history for himself, but it can't be to the detriment of our represented team members and the industry." And like I said, their statements just simply do not reflect what's been happening. Shawn Fain replied in a statement to their allegations, saying that Farley specifically was, quote, lying about the state of negotiations and he failed to show up for bargaining this week. Can you imagine going around to the news knowing full well that you haven't been present for bargaining and then saying that Shawn Fain is the one that doesn't have intent on reaching a clear, reaching a fair agreement? I mean, that's just amazing. And the issue with the CEO not being at the bargaining table, right, is that the CEO is going to be the decision maker. This is what actually a lot of employer employers will do in negotiations is they will send in lower level people who do not have the authority to move beyond a certain level, right? And so and so they're not able to move when they need to move. And so that's a bargaining tactic that employers use all the time. They need to have decision makers at the table, and Jim Farley was not at the table. Shawn Fain expanded. It could be because he failed to show up for bargaining this week, as he has for most of the past 10 weeks. If he were there, he would know that we gave Ford a comprehensive proposal on Monday and still haven't heard back. He would also know that we are far apart on core economic proposals like retirement security and post-retirement health care, as well as job security in this EV transition, which Farley himself says is going to cut 40% of our members' jobs. And this is the key thing. You know, if we'll remember, Jim Farley says that Shawn Fain is holding negotiations hostage over battery plants. And how do you call it holding negotiations hostage when you're talking about as big an issue as a 40% job loss? It's like, just definitionally have to be a huge part of negotiations. It would be irresponsible for the union not to make that a huge part of negotiations. Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate. And yet Jim Farley is saying, oh, they're holding it hostage over this thing, acting like this is some small issue that's cordoned off from the rest of the negotiations. It doesn't really matter. Not really a big deal. And yet he is also out the other side of his mouth saying 40% job losses. Insane. And the reason that the 40% job loss thing, that number has been kind of, that number has been questioned a little bit because there are fewer parts. There are fewer parts in some ways in the car, but then there's also different parts that also have to be made, right? So it may not be really 40%. But I think the consensus is that there is going to be some amount of less labor needed to create EVs, to create electric vehicles. And so, that's one of the reasons that the UAW is pushing so hard for something like a shortened work week. Because if you're looking at a situation where you do actually require less labor to build a vehicle, which, it may not be exactly 40%, but if it was, that would be huge. If you do need less labor to construct a vehicle, then it is simply not right that the employer be the entire beneficiary of that cut in labor costs. The workers should be the ones that benefit from this, from the lack of labor needed. Workers should get that time off instead of being laid off. But that's not what the companies want to do. And that's not what companies have historically done, where you don't have unions that are bargaining over things like automation or, less workforce needs. Then the employer simply takes all of these gains for themselves. And that's a huge reason that, unions are necessary. Because if you're not able to fight back against that kind of thing, then you're totally at the whim of your employer. And you take all of this extraneous risk upon yourself, where it should be borne at least both by the employer and the employee. And I think clearly it should be borne primarily by the employer. GM CEO Mary Barra attempted to cast the expanded strikes as theater, not progress. But that's a pretty difficult position to have to defend when for 2 weeks in a row now, Shawn Fain has, in good faith, spared one of the automakers from a strike expansion. She said, "It's clear there's no real intent to get to an agreement. It's clear Shawn Fain wants to make history for himself, but it can't be to the detriment of our represented team members in the industry. The UAW is pitting the companies against each other. But it's a strategy that ultimately only helps the non-union competition." And this is amazing. This quote is amazing. The UAW is pitting the companies against each other, because that's exactly what the employers have been doing to workers in any industry that you can think of for the past 5 decades. is pitting workers against each other, both in the United States, even just in the North, pitting locals against one another in the more heavily union North, but also pitting workers in the South against workers in the North. And of course, pitting Mexican workers against American workers, pitting Mexican workers against Vietnamese workers, against Chinese workers, right? There's always an attempt to play the workers off of each other. And so now that the workers are able, finally, in one instance, to pit the companies against each other to try to build leverage for themselves and negotiate a better deal for their members, the CEOs are freaking out. The CEOs are freaking out. And, you know, the fact that the CEOs of these companies are running around like chickens with their heads cut off, like the sky is falling, you know, we should really be seeing mea culpas and retractions from all of the, you know, unserious people on the internet that have been criticizing the UAW for their strike. Of course, we're not going to see that, you know, from people like the Do Dissidents folks, the Revolutionary Blackout Network, Sabrina Salvetti, all of these folks who, by their own admission, don't know anything about unions. They don't know anything about labor law. They don't know anything about union organizing. They don't know anything about collective bargaining, the process of collective bargaining or negotiations or anything like this. They don't know anything about this by their own admission, and yet they're coming out talking about the UAW, Shawn Fain, is selling out the membership. I mean, totally irresponsible, and totally for clicks. And it's difficult to see how, if the UAW is selling out the membership, why is it that the CEOs of these companies are running around with their heads cut off, like they've got like chickens with their heads cut off? But anyway, you know, they're not terribly relevant in the grand scheme of things. They just really get in my craw. But, you know, another thing about Mary Barra saying that there's no real intent to get to an agreement, that's also a pretty difficult position to have to defend when she also didn't show up for bargaining last week. I mean, neither Mary Barra nor Jim Farley showed up for bargaining last week. And yet they are trying to make us believe that Shawn Fain's the one that doesn't want to reach an agreement. I mean, really just wild stuff. Like, I mean, you know, I'm glad that, you know, one of the reasons that I really appreciate being a unionist, being a union member, being somebody that advocates on behalf of working people, is that of course it's good, and, you know, it's great, and, you know, workers deserve the world, all of this kind of stuff, right? You know, I think it's the good and moral thing to do is to be on the side of workers, but also it's so easy because I just have to tell the truth, right? Like, I don't have to misrepresent anything. I don't have to lie. I don't have to, you know, pretend that the other side is bargaining in bad faith when they're actually bargaining in good faith, you know? Like, I can just tell the truth. I can just tell people what happened, and it's going to be to the benefit of, you know, my side, quote unquote, the side of the workers. So that's a very, you know, that's a very helpful thing to be able to do, is just tell the truth. You don't have to remember what lies you're telling. So that's great.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.